I'm here with Steve Curl, Chair of the Strategic Oversight Board for Zero Carbon Cumbria, an initiative which brings together efforts to reduce carbon emissions across Cumbria. Thanks very much for being with us, Steve. Can you start off by telling us a bit about your background and how you came into this role at the forefront of tackling climate change?
Thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to be with you. Well, how did I come to be here? I guess it's worth just running through my background. I'll be very brief, but in my first job, which was with the International Energy Agency in Paris, I actually helped write a booklet on carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect, i.e. climate change. Now, that was 45 years ago. And the really alarming thing is that sadly, we've still got a very long way to go to get anywhere near net zero. We need to accelerate progress massively. So in a nutshell, for the first 15 years of my career, I worked in the full range of energy industries. That was energy conservation, renewables, fossil fuels, sadly, and nuclear power. I then moved on and got into a number of executive roles over the next 20 years with 3 software and technology service businesses. One was quoted in New York, one in London, and one was backed by private equity. And that private equity experience was so positive that I thought, yeah, I ought to really get into this in a bigger way. So I decided to build a portfolio of business interests, chairing private equity-backed companies, mainly in technology, business-to-business companies. Now, over my time, I've done about 8 of those deals. It's 8, I think, at the most 3 at a time, but now I'm down to just 1. So I've got much more time available to put into volunteering. So I moved to Cumbria about 20 years ago. And since then, I've built an evolving portfolio of voluntary roles, non-executive roles with the University of Cumbria, the National Park here in Cumbria, the Cumbria Local Enterprise Partnership, Transport for the North, Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund. And now, because I think it's so important, I'm chairing Zero Carbon Cumbria and our Strategic Oversight Board, which sets the direction for the whole programme we're embarked on. So I hope that's adequate background, Joe.
Yeah, that sounds like a very busy career there. So just coming back to Zero Carbon Cumbria, can you just explain what exactly is Zero Carbon Cumbria and what are its aims, and the goal that you've got of net zero by 2037?
Yeah, okay. So you're right. Achieving net zero by 2037 is our aim. Why 2037? That's kind of the scientifically derived date by which we need to achieve net zero if we're going to hold climate change temperature increases to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So it's a really important fact, whereas the government's 2050 date is a little more relaxed than that. And therefore, there's a chance of going through tipping points and overcooking the climate, as it were. So in terms of the partnership has got about 80 organisations right across the spectrum here in Cumbria. It was set up 2 or 3 years ago by the Cumbria Sustainability Network, an informal group of people with an interest in sustainability throughout the county, in parishes and locally, working alongside Cumbria Action for Sustainability, which is a charity obviously focusing on sustainability and very successful too. And what we're doing now is developing our plans to decarbonise the different sectors of the Cumbrian economy, and I can talk more about that later. And you might ask, why on earth are we doing this as an informal, often voluntary charity? And the answer is nobody else was doing it, and it needed doing. Without a project like this, which engages everybody that needs to take action, we've got absolutely no chance of achieving net zero. So we're filling a gap that, frankly, others perhaps should have taken action on at an earlier date.
So what's the plan for getting to that net zero target by 2037? Can you just talk about the kind of the main areas you're looking at? What are perhaps the sectors that produce the most emissions in the county, and what's the plan to kind of get them down to a reasonable amount.
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the sectors which have the high emissions. I mean, the really high emissions are coming from transport, heating buildings, and some industrial processes, of course, are big emitters. And it's interesting that the food and food supply chain is actually a major cause, and I'll perhaps come back to that later if we have time. So what are we doing? First of all, as you imply, we really have to map where Cumbria's greenhouse gases are coming from. Now, we've done that, and we've recently upgraded the Cumbria emissions report, which is available on the Zero Carbon Cumbria website. And we need to do the job properly when we have to address what are called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Very briefly, scope 1 is the direct emissions from our homes and our company and factory locations from burning fossil fuels. Scope 2 is the carbon emissions that happen indirectly because we use electricity generated from fossil fuels. And thirdly, scope 3 is emissions in our supply chain, whether that's the emissions in producing the motor cars we drive or the food we eat, or the supply chains going into factories and companies' operations. So having got that footprint, we've been able to focus on 4 key emission areas. Those are transport and travel, buildings, whether they're domestic buildings or industrial buildings, the consumption of stuff, how much we buy and eat and consume in business processes and supply chains as well, and how much waste that produces and how we reduce that and get rid of unavoidable waste in an effective way. And last but by no means least, farming and land uses, which not only emit carbon and greenhouse gases, but also have the ability to sequester or capture them in trees and peat bogs, where Cumbria has a large area of peat bogs as well as a lot of forestry, which we can increase. So having got this analysis for those sector groups and develop the plans, which are nearly complete, and we'll have them done by the end of the year, we'll then host a climate summit in the spring of next year with the key strategic delivery partners that can help make this happen. And after that, when everybody's on board, as I hope they will be, there's going to be a massive networking and communications exercise to motivate everybody to engage and share best practice and deliver what they can by way of decarbonisation. Now, we can't do that alone, so we're going to have to work through other organisations to network this. So we're going to have to work with local and county-wide community groups to get to individuals and to parishes and so on. We're going to have to work with the councils, Westmoreland and Furness and Cumberland. We're going to have to work with the National Park. And from a business perspective, it's really important that we work with people like yourselves at the Chamber, the Local Enterprise Partnership, Farmers Union, Farmers Network, Cumbria Tourism, and there are dozens of organisations like that. So we plan to build this out through a communications network. And finally, as we go through all this, and we're taking action to reduce our carbon footprint, we need to monitor our progress and see whether we're up to scratch and on the right trajectory to meet net zero. And if we're not, we're going to have to take additional action to try and close the gaps. So I hope that sets out very clearly what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. Joe.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that was really clear. I suppose that one of the stumbling blocks that businesses sometimes have is that they maybe don't have the investment that's necessary for a lot of the carbon reduction initiatives, which can be very costly. Can you talk a bit about that?
I think it's worth addressing what this really means for business and what they can do. And I'll come back to financing if I may. I mean, I think the key thing here is businesses and industry need to look at this as an opportunity more than a threat. And there's been a tendency to do the latter, which puts up a barrier, if you will. there are dozens of things that businesses can do in order to reduce their carbon footprint. And it's worth just going through some of those, I think. The first step for anybody is to look at what their carbon footprint is. And there are loads of software tools available for monitoring your carbon and assessing your carbon footprint. That helps you focus on what you need to do. The next thing I think is for businesses of all shapes and sizes, cutting their gas and electricity consumption for space heating, water heating, process heating, lighting. That's a quick win. Insulation, looking at moving from fossil fuels to electricity, clean fuels to be used in buildings and manufacturing processes, and doing the same for the transport in the supply chain is really important. There are lots of great tariffs available from electricity suppliers that use purely renewable energy, and encouraging people to move on to that is a great idea. Then, of course, you can do your own energy production using photovoltaics, ideally with batteries. That can be really very attractive from a financial point of view. But of course, the special thing about businesses is there's such a wide range of them and a wide range of their manufacturing and production processes. So individual businesses have to look very carefully at the heart of their manufacturing process, how it works, talk to equipment suppliers, and see whether they can decarbonize that in an appropriate way. A good example of that might be using hydrogen in glass manufacture, for example. But there's also some less obvious things, Joe, like encouraging the people that work with you in the business to look at how they can travel to work more sustainably, or even to provide that sort of travel. And a lot of people do that in Cumbria, a lot of employers do that in Cumbria. And to encourage them to take their own steps to decarbonise at home. That's a sort of third-party way of looking at decarbonisation. But the interesting thing about that is that if you encourage your staff to do that, you'll find that they're coming back to you and making suggestions as to how you should improve the business as well, which can be very helpful. So I've covered there quite a range of things, huge amount that can be done, and it's very much a tailored issue for each business to look at what they can do. I think the key point is there are lots of upsides for businesses if they decarbonise and do so wisely. Very importantly, businesses, can take many actions to reduce cost, as I've said, by taking decarbonising actions. So decarbonising actions reduce cost, they improve productivity very often, and they therefore bring direct benefits to the bottom line. And that's what businesses need to incentivise them to do this. I think the second thing is, as businesses move toward net zero, they're putting they need to put sustainability into their procurement criteria for their supply chain. Other businesses and organisations will be moving to net zero themselves, and they will demand that their suppliers meet their sustainability criteria. So if you want to stay competitive and compliant, businesses need to address their own sustainability and footprint. Similarly, more and more consumers are doing the same thing, and they're only going to buy from people that have got a sustainable production process. So that's really important for retaining market share. Thirdly, I think addressing decarbonisation and climate change is generating really significant opportunities for businesses, not least in diversifying. And some examples would be installation of heat pumps or solar voltaics, sustainable transport options, the supply of high quality and sustainable and low carbon food products, where Cumbria is very well placed, good quality stuff, right through to maintenance for offshore wind farms. And of course, at the high tech end, there's joining the supply chain for the nuclear industry, which is now viewed as a clean technology, and hopefully in the future supporting small modular reactors, SMRs, here in Cumbria, where I think we've got the skill set to bring them on board. In summary, there are so many options to bring advantage from decarbonising that there's too many to mention in this podcast.
on our Cumbria Business Growth Hub website now, we've got the Westmoreland and Furness Green Enterprise Hub, which has loads of resources for businesses kind of looking to decarbonize. How can businesses kind of get involved with the work that Zero Carbon Cumbria does?
Okay, so there's two key ways I think people can get involved. If businesses want to know what's going on and to exchange views with other parties doing similar things, they're very welcome to sign up to the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership, which in many ways today is very much an information exchange to critique and comment on what we're doing in the Zero Carbon Cumbria project. But the really important thing for them to do is to get on with the job of decarbonising their processes. And they can get help to do that from many organisations, not least, as you imply, the Chamber, but also Cumbria Action for Sustainability and our own website, zerocarboncumbria.co.uk. And there's a really important point here that businesses have a responsibility, just like we all do as individuals, to do our bit to address climate change. And I think in doing that, businesses have a key role, and they can learn a lot from each other by networking in collective groups, such as those that you might pull together in the Chamber from time to time.
So why should businesses and industry decarbonize? What's in it for them?
Yeah, well, I've already mentioned, as you know, some of the profitability and productivity benefits, but it's worth noting, I think, that in the future we're going to move to a low carbon economy inevitably, and the industries that thrive in the future will be those that take steps to reduce their carbon footprint. Those that stay with the old fossil fuel supply chain and high energy costs are going to find themselves with stranded assets and a declining market share, and eventually are going to go out of business, which is why you see so many of the big corporates now talking about their switch to low carbon green economy measures. There are stacks of benefits. And one of the points you raised earlier, Joe, was the capital costs and revenue costs of implementing decarbonisation measures. Even if they've got a high rate of return, finding the cash can be very difficult. There are grants available. You've mentioned one from Westmoreland and Furness. They're also available from central government for certain things. Overall, there are nothing like enough grants available to do what needs to be done on the timescale. So we've all got to push government hard to do more in that regard, and local government to involve themselves more closely in this, particularly here in Westmoreland and Furness and Cumberland. And it's also the case that there are increasingly funders available for debt provision or equity provision who are looking for businesses that want to grow, but want to grow in a sustainable way. And it's that sort of business that is going to be more attractive to the investors, be they people like the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund or private equity houses or just the regular business bank. They're going to look more positively towards those who are doing the right thing by way of the climate.
How big a challenge is this for businesses, do you think, for all the businesses in Cumbria to kind of work to get to the net zero target by 2037?
Well, I think overall the challenge is absolutely enormous, but broken down into individual actions by everybody in Cumbria, including all of our businesses, we can do this as a team effort, but it's going to require Cumbria to work in a way where everybody does their bit, and that's going to be the biggest team effort Cumbria has ever made. It's going to dwarf the efforts which were enormous for things like flooding and foot and mouth disease and other examples of how we've responded to an emergency. But this climate emergency impacts everybody, not just those that are flooded, for example. So it's a huge challenge, and we really need all of our strategic partners and our delivery partners to step up to the plate and join in this endeavour and move forward as one Cumbria to deliver a zero carbon county by 2037.
Do you really think we can get there by 2037?
But I'm not sure I'll be alive in 2037, but I hope so, and I'm assuming so. But we won't do it unless everybody takes responsibility for their carbon footprint and takes action. And organisations like the councils and the national parks and the chamber need to provide all the help that they possibly can for businesses particularly to do that.
Thanks very much for being with us on the podcast, Steve. Before you go, can you just tell everyone where they should go if they want to find out more about Zero Carbon Cumbria partnership, and where they can follow you on social media and things like that?
Yeah. So if you're interested in finding out more about Zero Carbon Cumbria, I suggest you look at the website, which is zerocarboncumbria.co.uk, and that has links on to our social media accounts as well. And of course, keep speaking to the Chamber of Commerce.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for your time today.